France entered the Second World War carrying a psychological burden heavier than any piece of military equipment it possessed. The nation's collective memory was still dominated by the slaughter of World War I, a conflict that killed nearly 1.4 million French soldiers and scarred an entire generation. Towns across northern and eastern France still bore visible wounds. Destroyed villages rebuilt stone by stone, cemeteries stretching for miles, and families permanently altered by loss. French military planners, politicians, and civilians alike believed that survival in a future war depended not on boldness, but on preventing another catastrophe of attrition. This belief shaped everything that followed. Strategy, doctrine, and even imagination were imprisoned by the fear of repeating 1914 to 1918, and that fear quietly determined how France prepared for war that would destroy it. Out of this trauma emerged the Maginot Line, not as a symbol of arrogance, but as a monument to grief and caution. Conceived in the late 1920s under Minister of War André Maginot, the line was an immense system of fortifications along the German border, featuring reinforced concrete bunkers, retractable artillery turrets, underground barracks, ammunition depots, hospitals, and rail systems. French commanders believed the line would serve three purposes: deter German invasion, protect industrial regions, and buy time for mobilization. To the French public, it represented safety and technological superiority. To critics, it was static and unimaginative. But to the men who had survived Verdun, it felt necessary, almost moral, to ensure that French soldiers would never again be sent to die helplessly in open fields. Politically, France in the 1930s was deeply unstable, and this instability quietly eroded its ability to prepare for modern war. Governments changed frequently, coalitions fractured, and long-term military planning was repeatedly interrupted by domestic crises. The rise of fascism in Germany and Italy coincided with economic depression and social unrest in France, weakening public support for large-scale rearmament. Defense budgets were debated endlessly, delayed, or redirected. While Germany centralized authority and accelerated military innovation under Hitler, France moved cautiously, restrained by democratic indecision and haunted by the belief that time would always favor defense over offense. French military doctrine reflected this mindset with painful clarity. Senior commanders such as General Maurice Gamelin believed that modern war would be slow, deliberate, and methodical. Plans emphasized rigid timetables, centralized command, and carefully coordinated movements controlled from high headquarters. Initiative at lower levels was discouraged, sometimes punished. Junior officers were trained to follow orders precisely, not to improvise. This culture produced discipline, but at the cost of flexibility. In an age when speed and adaptation were becoming decisive, the French army clung to predictability as a virtue. When war finally came in September 1939, France mobilized millions of men with remarkable efficiency. The army that assembled along the eastern frontier was large, experienced, and well-equipped on paper. Many soldiers were veterans of World War I or had grown up under its shadow. Yet as Germany invaded Poland, France's response revealed a gap between readiness and will. After declaring war, French forces conducted only limited, cautious operations into the Saar region before withdrawing. The army then settled into defensive positions, waiting. This period, later called the Phony War, lulled both soldiers and civilians into a false sense of security. Throughout the winter of 1939 to 1940, French and British troops waited behind defenses, drilled, maintained equipment, and listened to radio broadcasts. There was little fighting, and this absence of action reinforced dangerous assumptions. Many officers believed Germany would avoid a major offensive in the West for years. Others assumed that any future attack would resemble the slow, grinding campaigns of World War I. Few imagined a war decided in weeks. The enemy, though visible across the border, seemed distant, almost abstract. Meanwhile, inside Germany, a radically different approach was taking shape. German officers such as Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein argued that tanks, aircraft, and infantry could be combined into fast-moving formations capable of breaking through defenses and collapsing enemy command structures. This doctrine, later labeled Blitzkrieg, emphasized speed, surprise, and decentralized decision-making. Junior officers were encouraged to act independently if communications failed, Where French doctrine feared chaos, German doctrine embraced it as a weapon. One of the most critical assumptions made by French planners concerned the Ardennes forest. Stretching across eastern Belgium and Luxembourg, the Ardennes was characterized by dense woods, narrow roads, and steep valleys. French intelligence concluded that it was unsuitable for large-scale armored movement. As a result, this sector was lightly defended, assigned mostly to reserve divisions and older soldiers with limited anti-tank capability. It was not that French officers ignored the Ardennes entirely. They simply believed nature itself made it safe. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its invasion of Western Europe. Armies poured into the Netherlands and Belgium, exactly where the Allies expected them. French and British commanders responded as planned, sending their best forces northward to meet the attack. This movement felt logical, disciplined, and reassuring. It followed years of planning. Yet even as Allied armies advanced, the real blow was forming elsewhere, hidden behind the trees and roads of the Ardennes. German armored divisions moved through the Ardennes with astonishing speed. Traffic jams formed as thousands of vehicles crowded narrow roads, but the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, preventing Allied air attacks from disrupting the advance. German engineers repaired bridges on the move, and commanders pressed forward relentlessly. French reconnaissance reports warning of massive armored columns were often dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. The idea that tanks could move so quickly through the Ardennes seemed impossible to those who had planned otherwise. By the time German forces reached the Meuse River near Sedan, the French command system was already struggling to respond. Orders moved slowly through layers of headquarters. Field commanders waited for instructions that arrived too late. Communications failed under bombardment. At Sedan, German aircraft unleashed concentrated attacks that shattered French morale and disrupted defensive coordination. When German infantry crossed a river and secured bridgeheads, the psychological shock spread far beyond the immediate battlefield. The collapse that followed was not instant, but it was irreversible. French units fought bravely in many places, launching counterattacks and holding ground under intense pressure. Yet they were defeated not because they lacked courage, but because they were fighting a war their doctrine had not prepared them for. Speed overwhelmed caution. Initiative defeated rigidity. Within days, German armored columns were racing toward the English Channel, threatening to encircle entire Allied armies. As news of the breakthrough spread, panic rippled through France. Civilians fled cities and villages in vast columns, clogging roads needed by the military. Refugees mixed with retreating soldiers, creating scenes of chaos and despair. Rumors multiplied. Confidence in leadership eroded. What had begun as a controlled defensive war was transforming into a national collapse. By late May 1940, the unthinkable had happened. France, one of Europe's greatest military powers, was unraveling at a speed that stunned the world. The Maginot Line still stood, silent and largely untouched, while the enemy swept past it. The war France had prepared for had never arrived. Instead, it was facing a new kind of conflict, one defined by speed, shock, and psychological disintegration. And the fall had only just begun. The military catastrophe unfolding in France during late May 1940 exposed not only strategic failure, but profound breakdown of command at the highest levels. As German armored spearheads burst through the Meuse River defenses and raced westward, French high command struggled to comprehend events unfolding faster than their planning models allowed. General Maurice Gamelin, operating from his headquarters at Vincennes near Paris, relied on delayed reports, fragmented communications, and rigid assumptions that no longer matched reality. The centralized command system, once designed to ensure control, now became a bottleneck. Decisions required approval from distant headquarters, while German commanders on the ground were acting minute by minute, exploiting gaps before orders could even be written. One of the most devastating consequences of this rigidity was the Allied inability to mount a coordinated counterattack against the German breakthrough. French armored units existed and were formidable on paper, but they were scattered among infantry formations instead of concentrated into independent striking forces. When orders finally came to counter the German thrust near Sedan and Montcornet, they were poorly synchronized, undersupported by air power, and launched too late. Officers who attempted initiative often found themselves without clear authorization, while others waited for instructions that never arrived. German tanks continued to surge forward, not because French armor was weak, but because it was misused. At the tactical level, French soldiers experienced the collapse as a terrifying mixture of confusion and isolation. Units often fought bravely without understanding the broader situation, holding positions long after they had been outflanked or bypassed. Some battalions received orders to advance into areas already occupied by German forces, while others were told to withdraw without knowing where friendly lines existed. Communications equipment was overwhelmed or destroyed, leaving commanders to rely on runners or improvised signals. Many French soldiers later recalled the eerie sense of fighting alone in a war that no longer seemed coordinated or controlled. The German advance to the Channel coast in mid-May sealed the fate of Allied forces in northern France and Belgium. By driving westward at extraordinary speed, German armored divisions cut off the British Expeditionary Force and large portions of the French army, trapping them against the sea. This encirclement was not the result of overwhelming numbers, but of operational daring and relentless momentum. German commanders understood that speed itself was a weapon, preventing the Allies from regaining balance. Each mile gained widened the psychological gap between attacker and defender. As Allied armies realized they were trapped, attention turned to evacuation. The evacuation at Dunkirk, later celebrated as a miracle, was born out of disaster. French and British troops fought desperate rearguard actions to hold shrinking perimeter defenses, while hundreds of thousands waited on beaches under constant air attack. French soldiers made up a significant portion of those holding the line, buying time with their lives so others could escape. The evacuation saved men, but it could not save France's strategic position. The loss of equipment, cohesion, and morale was immense. Meanwhile, inside France, the political situation deteriorated rapidly. The government relocated from Paris to Tours, then to Bordeaux, mirroring the retreat of the army. Civilian panic spread as refugees poured southward, clogging roads and overwhelming towns. Trains were packed beyond capacity, families separated, and rumors of German atrocities intensified fear. The sense of national collapse extended far beyond the battlefield, creating an atmosphere in which defeat felt inevitable even before it was formally acknowledged. The psychological impact of German air power cannot be overstated. The Luftwaffe's use of dive bombers, particularly the Ju-87 Stuka, created terror disproportionate to their actual destructive power. The screaming sirens attached to the aircraft amplified fear, causing units to break under bombardment, even when casualties were limited. French soldiers, trained for artillery duels and positional warfare, found themselves psychologically unprepared for this new form of attack. Panic spread faster than orders, undermining unit cohesion at critical moments. Despite these failures, it is essential to understand that French soldiers did not simply surrender en masse. Many units fought stubbornly and courageously, often without hope of reinforcement or relief. Battles at places like Ston, dubbed the Verdun of 1940, saw intense fighting where ground changed hands repeatedly. French tanks proved capable in direct combat, sometimes outperforming their German counterparts. But isolated successes could not compensate for the collapse of the overall command structure and the inability to exploit local victories strategically. As German forces turned south toward Paris in early June, the French army was exhausted, fragmented, and increasingly leaderless. Units that had survived the northern encirclement were redeployed hastily, often without proper equipment or rest. New defensive lines were improvised, lacking depth or coordination. German commanders, sensing total disintegration, pressed relentlessly. The fall of Paris on June 14, 1940, occurred without a major battle, as the city was declared open to avoid destruction. Symbolically, the loss of the capital shattered any remaining illusion of resistance. Within the French leadership, debate turned from how to fight to whether continued resistance was even possible. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud argued for continuing the war from North Africa, preserving the fleet and empire to fight alongside Britain. Others, including Marshal Philippe Pétain, believed further resistance would only bring unnecessary suffering. The memory of World War I loomed heavily, reinforcing the belief that saving lives, even through surrender, was preferable to prolonged devastation. On June 16, 1940, Reynaud resigned and Pétain assumed power. The next day, he announced France's intention to seek an armistice. For many soldiers still fighting, the news was incomprehensible. Units received ceasefire orders while engaged the enemy, creating scenes of disbelief and bitterness. Some officers wept openly. Others destroyed weapons or burned unit colors to prevent their capture. The sense of betrayal, confusion, and grief would haunt survivors for decades. The armistice signed on June 22, 1940, formalized France's defeat and divided the country into occupied and unoccupied zones. German troops marched triumphantly through Paris, while French prisoners of war, nearly 2 million men, were marched east into captivity. The speed of the collapse stunned the world. A nation that had endured 4 years of slaughter in World War I had been defeated in 6 weeks. The question was no longer whether France had fallen, but how such a collapse could happen so quickly. The answer lay not in cowardice or lack of resources, but in a fatal mismatch between preparation and reality. France had prepared brilliantly for the wrong war. Its leaders planned for endurance when speed mattered, for control when flexibility was required, and for defense when offense defined survival. The result was not just military defeat, but a national trauma that reshaped France's identity and Europe's future. The German advance through France in June 1940 reached its apex with the dramatic encirclement of the Allied forces along the northern coast, a maneuver that will forever be remembered as one of the most stunning operational feats of the war. German panzer divisions, led by generals like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, had crossed the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line, and surged westward with unprecedented speed. By June 5th, German forces were within striking distance of the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and French units advancing into Belgium. For French soldiers on the ground, the chaos was unimaginable. Retreat orders, contradictory commands, and exploding communications left them isolated in a rapidly collapsing front. Many units fought heroically, but even acts of valor could not alter the overall strategic disaster that was unfolding. At Sedan, where the Meuse River had been crossed with astonishing efficiency, French artillery and infantry had initially resisted, inflicting casualties on the German attackers. Yet within hours, the scale and coordination of the German attack overwhelmed defenders. Luftwaffe dive bombers, including Stukas under the command of General Wolfram von Richthofen, targeted artillery positions, troop concentrations, and river crossings with precision. French officers, such as Colonel Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, later recounted the sense of disbelief as the ground literally seemed to move beneath German armor and communication lines disintegrated under relentless air assault. This was not merely defeat by numbers. It was a systematic dismantling of command, morale, and cohesion, executed with terrifying efficiency. The psychological dimension of the French collapse was magnified by the civilian exodus from northern cities. As German columns approached, residents of Lille, Amiens, and other towns fled southward along congested roads, often blocking retreating French units. Families in horse-drawn carts and overloaded vehicles converged with infantry columns, creating chaos that further hampered French military response. Soldiers recalled being trapped between advancing enemy forces and streams of terrified civilians, unable to maintain defensive positions or execute counterattacks. The collapse of civil order mirrored the military disintegration, producing a combined crisis of morale and logistical paralysis. Meanwhile, in Paris, the political leadership struggled to process the speed of the German advance. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and General Gamelin attempted to coordinate an organized withdrawal and counteroffensive, but rapidly deteriorating communication lines rendered their efforts largely symbolic. By June 10th, German units had crossed the Somme and were advancing toward the Seine, threatening to envelop the French capital. Reports from frontline commanders frequently reached the high command out of sequence, while radio broadcast dispatches and messengers became unreliable due to the intensity of air attacks and disrupted infrastructure. The centralized decision-making process that had once promised control instead produced confusion and hesitation at the most critical moments. The German strategy relied not only on mechanized speed, but on careful manipulation of Allied expectations. By concentrating armored divisions in the Ardennes and allowing secondary attacks through Belgium, German commanders created the illusion of multiple threats while focusing decisive power at points of least resistance. French generals, including Gamelin and General Alphonse Georges, reacted predictably, diverting their best troops northward toward Belgium to confront the expected main thrust. By the time the true point of attack became apparent, German armored columns were already deep behind French lines, moving toward the Channel at a pace that traditional French doctrine could not counter. This misalignment of expectation versus reality accelerated France's collapse beyond what any contemporary military analyst had predicted. The fall of the Channel ports in early June further compounded the crisis. Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne became focal points of desperate defense and evacuation. British and French troops, numbering hundreds of thousands, were trapped against the sea with limited supplies and constant Luftwaffe bombardment. The Battle of Dunkirk, while later celebrated as a miraculous evacuation, was fundamentally a rescue operation born from catastrophe. French rear guard units, such as those commanded by General Marcel Hiller and Colonel Pierre Ballat, fought to delay German advances, suffering severe casualties to allow other units to board evacuation vessels. The bravery of these units stood in stark contrast to the strategic collapse of France as a nation. The speed and decisiveness of German operations also exposed weaknesses in French logistics. Fuel shortages, poorly maintained vehicles, and insufficient reserves plagued the retreating armies. Armored units, despite technical superiority in some cases, could not operate continuously due to lack of supplies, while infantry divisions exhausted by retreat found themselves deployed without food, water, or ammunition. This logistical breakdown magnified the impact of German operational daring, turning what might have been a prolonged withdrawal into a rapid disintegration of forces. Within the Vichy leadership debates in early June, the question of continued resistance became intensely political. Marshal Philippe Pétain and other senior officials argued that further fighting would only lead to needless destruction and civilian suffering. Prime Minister Reynaud, by contrast, advocated continuing the fight from France's overseas colonies, hoping to maintain a government in exile alongside Britain. This internal conflict mirrored the battlefield disarray. Both military and political command were paralyzed at precisely the moment when decisive action was required. The armistice of June 22nd formalized the outcome of months of cumulative errors, misjudgments, and German audacity. French soldiers captured during these final weeks often described a surreal sense of dislocation. Prisoners reported being taken hundreds of kilometers into Germany under strict supervision, witnessing the disassembly of an entire military system as it was absorbed into enemy hands. The Wehrmacht treated prisoners methodically, ensuring that disarmament and registration occurred efficiently. For many French soldiers, the experience of captivity underscored the larger psychological defeat. The nation's institutions, once pillars of security, had been rendered irrelevant in the face of operational brilliance. Even after formal surrender, pockets of resistance persisted. Some units refused to comply with the armistice immediately, holding out in towns such as Montcornet and Stan, where French tanks and infantry attempted localized counterattacks. These efforts, although ultimately futile, revealed that collapse was uneven and that bravery and skill remained present even amid widespread organizational failure. Individual acts of courage could slow German advances and demonstrate tactical ingenuity, but they could not reverse the strategic momentum of a fully mobilized, aggressive Wehrmacht. The cultural impact of France's rapid fall was immediate and profound. For the French populace, the shock of the Blitzkrieg shattered assumptions of national invincibility. Intellectuals, journalists, and civilians struggled to explain how a nation that had withstood 4 years of trench warfare could be overcome in a matter of weeks. The psychological toll was amplified by images of advancing German tanks, burning villages, and fleeing refugees transmitted through newspapers and radio broadcasts. These images became part of the collective memory, influencing political decisions and public sentiment for decades to come. Internationally, the fall of France sent shockwaves through governments and populations alike. Neutral countries in Europe, including Switzerland, Sweden, and Spain, reassessed defense priorities and diplomatic alignments. The Soviet Union observed closely, noting the tactical efficiency of German forces and the vulnerabilities exposed in a democracy under pressure. The United States, still officially neutral, faced mounting internal debate about preparedness. military-industrial expansion, and the nature of modern warfare. France's collapse thus became a cautionary tale with immediate global consequences, affecting strategy, policy, and planning across continents. The long-term military lesson of France's rapid defeat lay in the mismatch between doctrine and reality. French preparations emphasized defense, centralized control, and cautious maneuvering, while German operations emphasized speed, decentralized initiative, and exploitation of surprise. Technology alone, tanks, artillery, or aircraft, could not compensate for inflexibility, poor communication, and rigid assumptions. The French army's courage was undeniable, but bravery without adaptability could not stop a mechanized force exploiting weaknesses at multiple levels simultaneously. By the time June 25th arrived and German occupation consolidated, the scale of France's fall was apparent. 2 million soldiers had been taken prisoner, vast swathes of territory were under German control, and civilian institutions struggled to maintain order under occupation. Yet beneath the defeat, seeds of future resistance had already been planted. Officers like Charles de Gaulle, as well as countless ordinary soldiers and civilians, began plotting ways to continue the struggle, ensuring that France's story did not end with capitulation. The collapse of 1940 was not just an end, but also the beginning of a complex, decades-long engagement with memory, resistance, and reconstruction. Why did France, a nation with such a proud military history, collapse so swiftly despite courage and preparation? How might the outcome have changed if commanders had embraced flexibility and initiative instead of rigid plans? Could lessons from 1940 help modern armies avoid similar psychological and logistical failures? How did civilian panic and rapid urban displacement affect military outcomes? And what can we learn about the human cost of war beyond the battlefield? As viewers, consider the interplay of leadership, morale, and strategy. How often does history hinge not on sheer strength, but on the capacity to adapt, think decisively under pressure, and act when everything seems lost?